In the crisp mountain air of Millfield, Colorado, where autumn leaves painted the landscape in shades of amber and gold, Jake Mitchell stood at the edge of his property, watching storm clouds gather over the Rockies. His weathered hands gripped the fence post as he calculated the days remaining before the bank would come calling. 60 days to save 3 generations of Mitchell family legacy, or watch it all disappear under the auctioneer's gavel. What he didn't know was that the pregnant woman shivering by the roadside just beyond his gate would hold the key to saving everything he held dear, even as she carried secrets that could destroy the trust he was about to offer her. Sometimes salvation comes disguised as the very thing we think will bring us down. And sometimes the greatest act of faith is opening your door to a stranger who has nothing left to lose. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning frost crunched under Jake Mitchell's boots as he made his way across the ranch yard, the familiar sound echoing against the stillness of dawn. Miller's Creek ran clear and cold through his property, carrying the first hints of winter runoff from the peaks above. At 35, Jake had the kind of weathered face that spoke of countless sunrises spent working the land, his grandfather's land, his father's land, and now his own burden to bear. The Lazy M brand had been burned into fence posts across these 500 acres for over 60 years. But lately Jake wondered if he'd be the Mitchell who let it all slip away. His cattle dog Blue trotted alongside him, ears alert to the sounds of the herd stirring in the distance. The black Angus cattle that dotted the golden fields represented everything Jake had left after his father's medical bills had eaten through their savings. Tom Mitchell had fought cancer with the same stubborn determination he'd shown in everything else, refusing to sell off land to pay for treatments that ultimately couldn't save him. Jake respected that choice, even as it left him drowning in debt that grew larger each month like a tumor of its own. The old homestead where Jake lived alone sat modest and sturdy against the backdrop of the Rockies, its log walls chinked and maintained with the same care his great-grandfather had shown when he first built it. Inside, the kitchen still smelled of coffee and leather, simple furniture worn smooth by decades of use. On the kitchen table, a stack of unopened bills from the bank created a small mountain of anxiety that Jake had been avoiding for 3 days running. The latest notice, marked urgent in red letters, hadn't even made it past the envelope because Jake already knew what it said. His sister Maria had called twice this week from town where she worked as the elementary school principal. Her voice always carried that mixture of love and frustration that came from watching someone you care about make choices that seemed designed to break your heart. "Jake, you can't keep carrying Dad's dream on your shoulders alone," she'd said during their last conversation. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go and start fresh somewhere new." But Maria didn't understand that this wasn't about stubbornness or pride, though Jake had plenty of both. This was about being the last link in a chain that stretched back to his great-grandfather who'd walked every inch of this land, who'd learned the seasonal patterns of the creek and the way snow fell differently on the north slopes versus the south. The Lazy M had survived drought, depression, market crashes, and every other challenge the mountains could throw at it. Jake's great-grandfather had built the original cabin with nothing but determination and an axe, clearing timber and hauling stone from the creek bed. His grandfather had expanded the operation during the good years after World War II, adding the barn that still housed their equipment, and building the corrals that held strong after decades of Colorado weather. Jake's father had modernized carefully, adding irrigation systems and upgrading the breeding program while keeping the soul of the place intact. Now it fell to Jake to either save it or watch it die. And most days he felt like he was fighting a losing battle against forces bigger than any one man could handle. The drought had been brutal this summer, forcing him to buy expensive hay when his own fields came up short. Cattle prices had dropped to 10-year lows just when he needed them most. The irrigation pump had broken down twice, each repair eating into funds he didn't have. One by one, the neighboring ranches had sold out to developers or corporate farming operations, leaving Jake feeling like a relic from another era. He walked the fence line now, checking posts and mending wire where needed, his hands moving through the familiar motions, while his mind wrestled with problems that seemed to multiply faster than he could solve them. These same hands had played guitar at Miller's Creek Saloon on Saturday nights, back when he'd harbored dreams of Nashville and recording contracts. But dreams had a way of adjusting themselves to fit reality's demands, and somewhere between his father's diagnosis and the mounting bills, music had become a luxury he couldn't afford to chase. The horses in the near pasture watched him work, including his father's favorite mare Buttercup, a golden palomino who'd been Tom Mitchell's pride and joy. The old horse had been his father's companion on countless rides through these hills, and now she served as a living reminder of the man who taught Jake everything about reading weather patterns and understanding cattle behavior. "We'll figure something out, old girl," Jake murmured as he reached through the fence to stroke her nose. Buttercup nickered softly, as if she understood the weight pressing down on her human shoulders. Back in the cabin, Jake finally forced himself to open the bank's letter, the words swimming together as he tried to focus on the numbers that spelled out his family's fate. The message was clearer than fresh mountain air and twice as cold. 60 days to bring the account current or face foreclosure proceedings. The amount needed made his stomach clench with familiar anxiety, more money than the ranch would generate in 2 profitable years, let alone in its current struggling state. Maria's weekly call came right on schedule, her voice carrying the hope and worry that had become their regular soundtrack. "Have you thought about the offer from Rocky Mountain Development?" she asked gently. "Jake, you know I hate to push, but they're talking serious money. Enough to pay off the debts and still leave you with a nest egg to start over somewhere else. When was the last time you took a real day off, or thought about your own future instead of carrying Dad's ghost around on your back?" He ended the call with the same vague promises to consider his options that he'd been making for months, knowing full well that considering and accepting were 2 entirely different things. Maria meant well, and her real estate connections had brought him offers that would solve his financial problems overnight. But those offers came with the understanding that the Lazy M would be carved up into luxury home sites for wealthy folks from Denver and Colorado Springs who wanted to play cowboy on weekends. Everything his great-grandfather had built, everything his father had preserved, would become nothing more than a backdrop for people who saw the mountains as scenery rather than home. The autumn evening settled over the ranch with the kind of crisp beauty that made tourist magazines and broke ranchers' hearts in equal measure. Jake sat on his front porch, watching the sun disappear behind peaks that had witnessed 3 generations of Mitchell men wrestling with the same fundamental question of how to make a living from land that gave back beauty and hardship in equal portions. The view before him was worth more than any developer's check. The gentle slope of pasture land rolling toward distant peaks where eagles nested and deer picked their way down to the creek each evening. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more bills that needed paying, more equipment that needed fixing, and more decisions that needed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story making. But tonight, in the quiet that came after the cattle had settled, and the wind had died down to whispers through the aspens, Jake allowed himself a moment of the peace that had sustained Mitchell men for 3 generations. Whatever came next, he would meet it with the same determination and dignity that had carried his family through 6 decades of mountain living. The stars were just beginning to show themselves against the darkening sky when Jake noticed movement on the county road that ran past his property. A solitary figure walked along the gravel shoulder, moving slowly and stopping frequently as if the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other required more energy than they possessed. In the gathering darkness, Jake could make out the shape of someone carrying what looked like a backpack, their posture suggesting exhaustion or illness or both. Living as far from town as he did, Jake rarely saw pedestrians on the road that led primarily to ranch properties and summer cabins. The nearest bus stop was 12 miles away in Millfield proper, and the mountain nights were already dropping below freezing. Whoever was out there walking in the dark was either lost or desperate, and Jake's upbringing wouldn't let him simply watch from his porch while someone potentially froze to death on the road that bordered his land. Meanwhile, 3 states away in a penthouse office overlooking downtown Denver, the boardroom at Rodriguez Development Group hummed with tension as Victoria Rodriguez addressed the quarterly meeting with her characteristic blend of steel and silk. The family real estate empire had built its reputation on identifying undervalued properties, and transforming them into luxury developments that catered to Colorado's booming population of wealthy transplants seeking mountain lifestyles. On the presentation screen, aerial photographs showed vast expanses of ranch land in the Arkansas River Valley, each property marked with potential profit margins that made the board members lean forward with interest. The Mitchell property in Millfield represents our most significant opportunity this quarter, Victoria announced, her manicured finger pointing to a detailed topographical map. 500 acres of prime mountain ranch land, adjacent to national forest, with water rights that alone are worth millions in the current market. Around the conference table, development executives nodded approvingly as Victoria outlined their acquisition strategy. The current owner is a third-generation rancher facing financial difficulties. She explained with the clinical detachment that had made her one of Denver's most successful real estate magnates. Our research indicates significant debt load and declining cattle profits. We expect minimal resistance to a generous cash offer, particularly given his sister's involvement in local real estate. What the board members and development executives didn't know was that Victoria Rodriguez had a personal connection to the poverty and desperation they were so efficiently exploiting. Hidden in her private office safe, behind tax documents and insurance policies, sat a photograph of a young woman with Victoria's same dark eyes and determined chin. The woman in the photograph was her daughter Emma, who had walked out of the family business and the family fortune 6 months earlier, choosing principles over prosperity in a way that Victoria both admired and resented. Emma Rodriguez had discovered her family's practice of targeting struggling family operations, buying them out at below-market prices, and transforming generational ranches into exclusive developments that priced out local communities. Her whistleblowing had cost the family millions in delayed projects and negative publicity, but more importantly, it had cost Victoria her relationship with the daughter she'd groomed to take over the empire she'd spent 30 years building. The irony wasn't lost on Victoria that the Mitchell Ranch represented exactly the kind of acquisition Emma had opposed. A family operation with deep roots and cultural significance, struggling against economic forces beyond their control, ripe for corporate takeover by people who saw land as commodity rather than heritage. But business was business, and Victoria had learned long ago to separate her personal feelings from profitable opportunities. As the meeting concluded, and the executives filed out discussing timeline and financing options, Victoria remained at the conference table, staring at the aerial photograph of the Lazy M. Somewhere in her carefully controlled heart, she wondered if Emma was safe, if the pregnancy was progressing normally, and if the stubborn pride that had driven her daughter away would eventually bring her home. But those thoughts belonged to Victoria the mother, and she had learned to silence that voice in favor of Victoria the businesswoman who never let sentiment interfere with success. Back in the Colorado mountains, Emma Rodriguez pulled her thin jacket tighter against the evening chill as she walked along the gravel road that seemed to stretch endlessly through the darkness. 7 months pregnant and homeless, she carried everything she owned in the backpack that grew heavier with each step. Her feet, swollen from pregnancy and inadequate shoes, protested against the uneven surface, while her back ached from the additional weight she carried both in front and behind. The mountain air that tourists found so invigorating felt sharp and hostile in her lungs as she struggled to maintain a pace that would keep her warm without exhausting her limited energy reserves. She had been walking since noon, when the bus driver had put her off at what he claimed was Millfield, but which turned out to be nothing more than a crossroads with a broken sign and no shelter from the approaching weather. In her backpack, carefully wrapped in plastic bags to protect them from moisture, Emma carried the remnants of her former life. Business cards from her position as marketing director at Pinnacle Communications, where she'd earned 6 figures helping corporations craft messages that hid uncomfortable truths about their environmental and social impact. Credit cards linked to accounts she refused to access, each one connected to the family money she'd rejected when she discovered how that wealth was generated. Prenatal vitamins prescribed by Dr. Amanda Wells, her former private physician, who'd been calling repeatedly to discuss the importance of regular checkups for high-risk pregnancies. Most significantly, Hidden in a sealed envelope at the bottom of her pack lay documents that could solve every financial problem she faced. Trust fund paperwork worth $2.8 million, established by her grandmother Rodriguez, who'd believed that women should have independent means regardless of family politics. Emma had the legal right to access those funds at any time, but doing so would mean admitting that her principles were negotiable, that her criticism of her family's business practices had been nothing more than youthful idealism that could be bought off with sufficient financial pressure. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her mother's distress, and Emma paused by the roadside to catch her breath and adjust her backpack straps. The movement inside her belly served as a constant reminder of the responsibility she carried and the precarious nature of her current situation. She had maybe $40 in cash, no permanent address, and winter approaching in mountain country, where temperatures could drop below zero without warning. Her story had begun 6 months earlier when she discovered internal documents at Rodriguez Development Group, detailing their practice of targeting struggling family farms and ranches for below-market acquisition. The strategy was perfectly legal, but morally questionable, identifying properties where drought, debt, or family tragedy had created desperate sellers willing to accept quick cash offers rather than fight for fair market value. Emma's attempt to change the company's practices from within had failed spectacularly, resulting in heated confrontations with her mother and the board of directors, who saw her objections as naive sentimentality that threatened profitable business operations. Her decision to take the story to investigative reporters had triggered a family crisis that ended with Victoria giving her daughter an ultimatum: abandon her crusade against the company, or lose all financial support and family connections. Emma had chosen her principles over her privilege, walking away from millions of dollars and a guaranteed position in Denver's social elite. Her pregnancy, the result of a relationship with a fellow whistleblower who'd abandoned her when the legal and financial pressures intensified, had complicated her situation but hadn't changed her fundamental decision to live according to her conscience rather than her bank account. Now, walking through the Colorado darkness with her unborn child and her uncompromising principles as her only companions, Emma faced the practical consequences of moral courage. She was cold, tired, hungry, and running out of options that didn't involve either accessing her trust fund or swallowing her pride and returning to a family that had made clear she was welcome only on their terms. The lights of a ranch house appeared through the darkness, like a beacon of warmth and safety, and Emma found herself unconsciously slowing her pace as she approached the property line. Through the gathering night, she could see a man sitting on the front porch of a modest log cabin, his silhouette outlined against the golden glow of windows that suggested comfort and security. For a moment, Emma allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to knock on that door, to ask for help from a stranger who had no knowledge of her family connections or personal failures. But the fantasy dissolved as quickly as it had formed because she had nothing to offer in return for such kindness. No way to repay hospitality, except with the complications and dangers that seemed to follow her like storm clouds. As she continued walking past the ranch entrance, Emma didn't notice the man on the porch standing up and reaching for his jacket, or the way his cattle dog raised its head with interest at her presence on the road. She was focused entirely on putting one foot in front of the other, on making it through another night, on protecting the life growing inside her while navigating a world that had become increasingly hostile to her survival. Behind her, Jake Mitchell pulled on his work jacket and called to Blue, his decision made by instincts deeper than caution or self-interest. Someone was in trouble on his road, walking alone in dangerous conditions, and his upbringing had never allowed him to turn away from people who needed help regardless of the inconvenience or risk to himself. The collision of their two worlds was only minutes away, though neither Emma nor Jake could have predicted that their meeting would transform both their lives in ways that would ripple out far beyond the boundaries of the Lazy Men Ranch, or the immediate crisis that was about to bring them together in the Colorado darkness. Jake's boots crunched against the gravel as he approached the figure on the road, Blue trotting beside him with ears alert to potential danger. The closer he got, the clearer it became that the person walking was a young woman, heavily pregnant, and moving with the careful gait of someone who had reached the limits of physical endurance. Her backpack looked too heavy for her condition, and even in the dim light from his porch, Jake could see that her clothes were inadequate for the mountain cold that was settling over the valley like a wool blanket. "Ma'am," he called out softly, not wanting to startle her. "You all right out here?" The woman stopped walking but didn't turn around immediately, her shoulders tensing as if she was calculating whether this stranger represented help or another problem to navigate. When she finally faced him, Jake saw a face that belonged to someone much younger than her circumstances suggested, with dark eyes that held the kind of wariness that came from too many disappointments, and not enough kindness. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady, despite the obvious exhaustion that made her sway slightly on her feet. "Just passing through." But even as she spoke, Jake could see that she was anything but fine. Her lips had a bluish tinge that suggested hypothermia. Her hands shook as she adjusted her backpack straps, and the way she kept one hand protectively over her swollen belly told him that she was not just responsible for her own welfare. "Name's Jake Mitchell," he said, gesturing toward his property. "That's my place back there. You look like you could use a warm meal and maybe a place to rest for the night. I've got a spare room and my sister would tan my hide if she found out I let a pregnant woman walk past in this cold without offering help." Emma looked toward the ranch house with longing so obvious it made Jake's chest tighten with sympathy, but she shook her head with the stubborn pride of someone who had learned not to trust easy offers. "I appreciate the kindness, but I can't pay you anything," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want charity, and I don't want to cause problems for you." Jake studied her face in the dim light, noting the intelligence in her eyes, and the way she carried herself despite her obvious exhaustion. This wasn't someone who had grown up on the streets or made poor life choices that led to homelessness. This was someone who had fallen through the cracks, despite having advantages that should have protected her. "Well," he said slowly, "I wasn't thinking about payment. But if it makes you feel better, I could use some help around the place. My housekeeper quit last month, and I've been living on canned soup and toast ever since. If you can cook and don't mind lending a hand with some light work, we could call it even." Emma's eyes searched his face for signs of deception or ulterior motives, the careful evaluation of someone who had learned that kindness often came with strings attached. "What kind of work?" she asked cautiously. Jake shrugged, keeping his tone casual despite the growing concern he felt for her condition. "Nothing heavy, just basic household stuff. Cooking, maybe some bookkeeping if you've got a head for numbers. I've got accounts that haven't been balanced in months because I keep putting it off." The mention of bookkeeping made something flicker in Emma's eyes, a hint of the professional competence she'd once taken for granted. "I used to work in business," she said carefully. "I know my way around spreadsheets and financial records." Jake nodded as if this was perfectly normal, as if pregnant homeless women with business backgrounds showed up on his road every day looking for work. "Well then, sounds like we might be able to help each other out. Why don't you come up to the house and we can talk about it over some hot coffee? I've got a pot that's been brewing since this afternoon, and it's either drink it or use it to strip paint off the barn." Despite herself, Emma smiled at his attempt at humor, and Jake felt a small victory at seeing some of the tension leave her shoulders. The baby kicked as if in agreement, and Emma's hand moved automatically to the spot where small feet were making their presence known. "All right," she said finally. "But just for tonight. I'll work for my keep and be gone in the morning." Jake nodded seriously, understanding that she needed to feel like this was a business arrangement rather than charity. "Fair enough," he agreed. "Though I should warn you, once you taste my sister Maria's recipe for beef stew, you might change your mind about leaving so quick. She left some in my freezer with detailed instructions that I've been too proud to follow. Maybe you could walk me through the process so I don't embarrass the Mitchell family name with my cooking." As they walked toward the house, Blue padding along beside them, Jake found himself studying his unexpected guest out of the corner of his eye. There were inconsistencies in her appearance that spoke of a story more complex than simple homelessness. Her backpack was expensive, the kind of technical gear that cost hundreds of dollars, and was designed for serious hiking rather than carrying belongings from place to place. Her shoes, while worn, were quality leather that had been resoled at least once, suggesting someone who took care of possessions rather than discarded them carelessly. Most telling of all, her speech patterns and vocabulary belonged to someone with significant education and professional experience. The warm glow from the ranch house windows grew brighter as they approached, and Jake noticed how Emma's pace quickened slightly despite her exhaustion. The promise of warmth and safety, even temporary, was enough to override her natural caution. Blue bounded ahead to announce their arrival, his tail wagging with the enthusiasm of a dog who rarely saw new people on the isolated ranch. Inside the cabin, Jake busied himself with starting fresh coffee while Emma stood awkwardly by the door, clearly unsure of the protocol for accepting help from strangers. The interior of the house was exactly what she had expected from the outside. Simple, clean, and comfortable without being fancy. Hand-carved furniture that had been built to last, rugs that showed wear but were well maintained, and walls decorated with family photographs that spoke of generations of Mitchell men who had worked this land. "Why don't you sit down while I get this coffee going?" Jake suggested, indicating the kitchen table where morning sunlight would stream through windows that currently showed only darkness. "You look like you've been walking for quite a while." Emma lowered herself carefully into one of the wooden chairs, her back protesting the change in position after hours of carrying extra weight. The warmth of the house made her realize just how cold she had become, and she had to resist the urge to curl up in the chair like a cat seeking heat. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what Emma needed to chase away the chill that had settled into her bones during the long walk from town. Jake sat across from her at the table, keeping his distance but close enough to gauge her condition and make sure she wasn't going to collapse from exhaustion. He had dealt with enough sick cattle and injured horses to recognize the signs of someone who was pushing their body beyond safe limits. "When did you eat last?" he asked gently, noticing how she wrapped both hands around the coffee mug as if it was a lifeline. Emma considered lying, but the practical part of her mind recognized that she needed help whether her pride wanted to admit it or not. "This morning," she said quietly, "I had some crackers and an apple from a convenience store in town." Jake's jaw tightened at the thought of a pregnant woman going nearly 12 hours without proper nutrition, but he kept his expression neutral to avoid making her feel worse about her situation. "Well, let's fix that right now," he said, standing up and moving to the refrigerator. "I may not be much of a cook, but I can manage eggs and toast without burning down the kitchen." While he worked, Jake kept up a steady stream of casual conversation designed to help Emma relax and maybe learn something about her background without seeming to pry into private matters. "So, you mentioned business experience," he said as he cracked eggs into a pan. "What kind of work did you do?" Emma hesitated, carefully editing her response to avoid revealing too much about her family connections or the circumstances that had led to her current situation. "Marketing and communications," she said finally. "I helped companies develop strategies for reaching new customers and managing public relations challenges. It was interesting work, but the industry can be pretty volatile." Jake nodded understandingly, thinking about the challenges of running any business in an uncertain economy. "I can imagine. Ranching's got its own ups and downs depending on weather and market prices, but at least cattle don't usually go out of style the way some products do." He plated the eggs alongside buttered toast and set the food in front of Emma, who looked at the simple meal as if it was a feast prepared by professional chefs. The first bite made Emma's eyes close with pleasure, and she had to force herself to eat slowly rather than wolf down the food like someone who hadn't seen a decent meal in days. Jake pretended not to notice her obvious hunger, understanding that maintaining some dignity was important to her sense of self-worth in a situation that had stripped away most of her control over her circumstances. "This is really good," Emma said after finishing half the plate. "You were being modest about your cooking skills." Jake smiled, pleased to see some color returning to her cheeks as the warm food did its work. My dad always said that hunger was the best seasoning, but I think good ingredients don't hurt either. These eggs come from my neighbor's chickens, and the bread is from the bakery in town. Nothing fancy, but it's all local and fresh. As Emma continued eating, Jake found himself studying her more carefully, noting details that suggested she was more familiar with quality food than her current circumstances would indicate. She held her fork with the unconscious grace of someone who had learned proper table manners young. And her appreciation for the simple meal seemed to come from genuine hunger rather than lack of experience with better cuisine. The spare room I mentioned is just down the hall, Jake said as Emma finished her food. It's not much, just a bed and a dresser, but it's warm and private. You can stay as long as you need to get back on your feet. There's no rush and no strings attached. Emma looked up from her empty plate, her dark eyes searching his face for hidden motives or expectations that might complicate the generosity he was offering. "Why are you helping me?" she asked directly. "You don't know anything about me or what kind of trouble I might be running from. I could be dangerous or crazy or running from the law." Jake considered his answer carefully, recognizing that honesty was more important than diplomacy in this moment. "Because someone helped my family once when we needed it," he said simply. "My grandmother got sick when I was about 10, and we were struggling to keep up with medical bills and ranch work. A neighbor family stepped in without being asked, helped us through the worst of it, never expected anything in return." He refilled her coffee cup before continuing. "My dad always taught me that kindness is like water in a drought. You share what you have when someone needs it, and trust that it'll come back around when you're the one who's thirsty. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "you don't look particularly dangerous to me. Tired and probably worried about that baby you're carrying, but not dangerous." Emma's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where the baby had settled into a more comfortable position now that she was sitting still and warm. The child seemed to respond to the improved conditions, moving gently rather than the restless kicking that had accompanied the long walk through the cold. "I'm not running from the law," she said quietly, "but I am running from some complications that could affect anyone who tries to help me. It might be better for both of us if I moved on in the morning." Jake leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same careful attention he gave to evaluating livestock or weather patterns. "Complications come in all shapes and sizes," he said thoughtfully. "Most of them look worse at night when you're tired and scared than they do in daylight when you've had some rest and a chance to think clearly. Why don't you sleep on it and see how things look in the morning? If you still want to leave, I'll drive you wherever you need to go." The offer of transportation surprised Emma, who had grown accustomed to people helping only as long as it was convenient for them. The genuine concern in Jake's voice made her throat tighten with emotions she had been suppressing for months. The relief of finding someone who offered help without immediately calculating what they might gain in return. "All right," she said softly. "One night, but I meant what I said about working for my keep. I don't accept charity." Jake stood up and began clearing the dishes, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well then, you can start by showing me how to heat up that beef stew tomorrow. My sister claims her instructions are foolproof, but I've managed to burn water before, so we'll see." Emma found herself almost smiling at his self-deprecating humor. The first time in weeks that her situation had seemed anything other than desperately serious. The spare room was simple but clean, with a handmade quilt on the bed and curtains that would block the morning sun when it came streaming over the mountains. Emma stood in the doorway holding her backpack, overwhelmed by the luxury of privacy and safety after weeks of sleeping in shelters or cheap motels where she had to stay alert to potential dangers. Jake appeared with an armload of towels and a bar of soap, setting them on the dresser with the casual efficiency of someone accustomed to taking care of practical needs. "Bathroom's right across the hall," he said. "Hot water takes about 2 minutes to reach the back of the house, so don't give up if it starts out cold. There's extra blankets in the closet if you get chilly during the night. Mountain temperatures can drop pretty fast once the sun goes down." Emma nodded, suddenly feeling shy about accepting so much kindness from someone she had just met, someone who had no reason to trust her or invest in her welfare. "Jake," she said as he turned to leave. "Thank you. I know you don't owe me anything, and I appreciate you taking a chance on a stranger." Jake paused in the doorway, his weathered face gentle in the soft light from the hallway. "Everyone deserves a safe place to sleep, especially when they're carrying new life. My mother would come back and haunt this house if she thought I'd let a pregnant woman walk past without offering help. You rest up, and we'll talk more in the morning. Alone in the room, Emma sat on the bed and allowed herself to acknowledge just how close she had come to real danger on the mountain road. The temperature was already dropping below freezing, and she had been unprepared for a night in the open air. Her pregnancy made her more vulnerable to cold and exhaustion, and she had been foolishly optimistic about finding shelter in a rural area where services were limited and strangers were scarce. She unpacked her few belongings carefully, hanging her extra clothes in the small closet and placing her important documents in the dresser drawer where they would be safe and easily accessible. The trust fund papers felt heavier than their physical weight suggested, representing both security and compromise in equal measure. Every day that she avoided accessing those funds was another day of proving to herself that her principles were worth more than her comfort, but every day also brought new risks to her unborn child. The hot shower was a revelation after weeks of quick washes in public restrooms and shelters, and Emma stood under the spray longer than was probably polite, feeling the tension ease from muscles that had been clenched with stress and cold for too long. The baby moved contentedly as warmth spread through her body, and for the first time in weeks, Emma felt like she might actually be able to sleep without one ear listening for potential threats. As she settled into bed under the handmade quilt, Emma listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into nighttime quiet. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly to each other, and the wind whispered through the aspens that surrounded the cabin. These were peaceful sounds, the kind that spoke of safety and continuity rather than the harsh urban noises she had grown accustomed to during her months of homelessness. Jake's kindness felt genuine in a way that Emma had almost forgotten was possible, free of the calculating self-interest that had characterized most of her interactions since leaving her family's world. He had asked for nothing beyond honest work in exchange for food and shelter, treating her as a person worthy of basic human dignity rather than a problem to be solved or an opportunity to be exploited. But even as Emma felt herself relaxing into sleep, part of her mind remained alert to the danger that her presence might bring to this peaceful place. Her family's reach was long, and their investigators were thorough. If they traced her to the Mitchell Ranch, they would not hesitate to use whatever leverage they could find to pressure her into returning to the fold. Jake's financial troubles would make him vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation that Rodriguez Development Group specialized in, and Emma's growing affection for her generous host made the thought of bringing such complications into his life unbearable. The next morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen where Jake was already beginning his daily routine. Emma woke feeling more rested than she had in weeks, her body grateful for the comfortable bed and secure environment that had allowed for genuine sleep rather than the anxious dozing that had become her norm. In the kitchen she found Jake studying a handwritten recipe card with the concentration of someone trying to decode ancient hieroglyphics. The ingredients for beef stew were spread across the counter in careful order, but his expression suggested that the actual cooking process remained a mystery despite his sister's detailed instructions. "Good morning," Emma said, accepting the cup of coffee he offered with a smile that felt natural for the first time in months. Having trouble with the recipe, Jake looked up from the card with relief evident in his eyes. "I can identify every ingredient separately, but putting them together in the right order without creating a disaster is apparently beyond my skill set. My sister swears this is foolproof, but she's never seen what I can do to perfectly good food when left to my own devices." Emma moved to the counter and studied the recipe card, her professional experience with project management allowing her to break down the cooking process into logical steps that even someone with limited culinary skills could follow. "The first step is browning the meat," she explained, reaching for the package of beef cubes. "That locks in the flavors and creates a base for everything else. While that's cooking, we can prep the vegetables so they're ready to add at the right time." Working together in the kitchen created an easy intimacy that surprised them both, their movements coordinating naturally as Emma guided Jake through the cooking process while he handled the heavier tasks that were becoming difficult for her in her advanced pregnancy. The baby seemed to respond positively to the improved nutrition and reduced stress, moving gently rather than the agitated kicking that had become Emma's constant companion during the most difficult weeks of her homelessness. As the stew simmered and filled the kitchen with rich aromas, Jake and Emma found themselves talking about subjects that had nothing to do with her immediate crisis or his financial troubles. She told him about her love of hiking and camping, skills she had learned during college outdoor programs that had served her well during her months of uncertain housing. He shared stories about growing up on the ranch, the satisfaction of working with animals and land, the way seasonal cycles created a rhythm that connected him to something larger than individual concerns. There was something healing about the ordinary domestic tasks they shared, Emma thought as she watched Jake set the table with the same careful attention he probably brought to ranch work. After months of uncertainty and temporary solutions, the simple act of preparing and sharing a meal felt like a return to normal life. A reminder of the basic human connections that made survival worthwhile. The beef stew turned out perfectly, rich and hearty with vegetables that maintained their texture and meat that fell apart at the touch of a fork. Jake's obvious pleasure in the successful cooking project made Emma smile, and she found herself enjoying his company in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude for his help and everything to do with genuine compatibility. "You're a good teacher," Jake said as they finished eating. "I actually feel like I understand what I was doing instead of just following instructions blindly. Maybe I won't have to live on canned soup and toast after all." Emma felt a warm glow of accomplishment at his praise, realizing how much she had missed the satisfaction of being useful and competent rather than simply surviving from one day to the next. After lunch, Jake offered to show Emma around the ranch, partly to demonstrate the scope of work that might be available if she decided to stay longer, and partly because he could see that she was someone who would appreciate the beauty and purpose of the operation his family had built over 3 generations. They walked slowly to accommodate her condition, Jake pointing out various features of the property, while Emma asked intelligent questions that demonstrated her quick grasp of the ranching business. The cattle were magnificent animals, sleek and healthy despite the economic pressures that threatened the ranch's survival. Emma could see the pride in Jake's face as he talked about breeding programs and grazing rotation, the way he knew each animal's personality and health status. This was clearly more than just a business to him. It was a calling that connected him to the land and to the generations of Mitchell men who had worked these same fields. But Emma's business background also allowed her to see the problems that Jake's emotional attachment might prevent him from recognizing clearly. Equipment that needed replacement, infrastructure that required expensive updates, marketing opportunities that weren't being fully utilized. The ranch had potential for profitability, but it would require capital investment and strategic planning that went beyond the traditional methods that had served the Mitchell family for 60 years. That evening, as they shared another simple meal in the kitchen that was beginning to feel familiar, Emma made a decision that surprised them both. "If the offer still stands," she said carefully, "I'd like to stay a little longer. Maybe help you get those books organized and see if there are ways to improve the ranch's financial position. I have some ideas that might help, but I'd need to see the actual numbers to know if they're viable." Jake looked up from his plate, studying her face with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to trust easy solutions to complex problems. "You sure you want to get involved in all this mess?" he asked gently. "I appreciate the offer, but I wouldn't want you to feel obligated because I helped you out. This arrangement should work both ways, or it won't work at all." Emma met his gaze steadily, recognizing the integrity behind his concern and respecting him more for his reluctance to take advantage of her gratitude. "I'm not offering out of obligation," she said quietly. "I'm offering because I think I might actually be able to help, and because working on something constructive would be good for me right now. I've been feeling pretty useless for the past few months, and it would mean a lot to have a project that matters." The honesty in her voice convinced Jake more than any elaborate argument could have. And he nodded slowly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "All right then, partner," he said, extending his hand across the table. "Let's see what we can figure out together." Emma shook his call-used hand with her own smaller one. feeling for the first time in months that she was moving towards something positive rather than simply running away from problems that seemed too big to solve. That night, as Emma settled into bed in the room that was beginning to feel like home, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to stay at the lazy Emma Ranch long enough to see her ideas implemented, to watch Jake's face when the financial situation improved, to contribute something meaningful to the preservation of a way of life that represented everything good about hard work and family legacy. But even as she indulged in these hopeful fantasies, Emma knew that her presence at the ranch was temporary at best and potentially dangerous at worst. Her family's investigators were thorough and well-funded, and it was only a matter of time before someone traced her movements to this remote corner of Colorado. When that happened, Jake's kindness would make him vulnerable to exactly the kind of corporate pressure that had driven Emma away from her privileged life in the first place. The baby kicked gently, as if responding to her mother's troubled thoughts, and Emma placed both hands on her swollen belly, silently promising her unborn child that she would find a way to build a stable life that didn't require choosing between financial security and moral integrity. Somehow, in this peaceful ranch house with its handmade quilts and genuine kindness, that promise felt more achievable than it had since she first discovered the truth about her family's business practices. Outside her window, the Colorado mountains stood silhouetted against a sky brilliant with stars, and Emma fell asleep to the gentle sounds of cattle settling for the night and wind whispering through the aspens. For the first time in months, tomorrow felt like something to anticipate rather than simply endure. And that shift in perspective felt like the first step toward the kind of life she wanted to build for herself and her child. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Emma made her way carefully down the cabin steps, one hand on the railing and the other supporting her growing belly. 3 days had passed since her arrival, and she was beginning to establish a routine that felt surprisingly natural despite the temporary nature of her arrangement with Jake. The mountain air was crisp with the promise of winter, but the physical discomfort of her advancing pregnancy seemed less overwhelming now that she had proper nutrition and a safe place to rest. Jake was already at work in the main barn, the sound of hammering echoing across the yard as he repaired a stall door that had been damaged by an agitated bull the previous week. Emma had learned that he started each day before dawn, checking on the cattle and handling the dozens of small maintenance tasks that kept a ranch operation running smoothly. His dedication was both admirable and concerning, given that he was managing work designed for several people while also trying to keep up with the business side of ranching that clearly wasn't his strength. In the kitchen, Emma had begun organizing Jake's financial records, spreading the papers across the dining table in neat categories that made sense to her business-trained mind. The picture that emerged from months of neglected bookkeeping was both better and worse than she had expected. The ranch was generating more income than Jake realized, but expenses were bleeding away profits through inefficiency and poor timing rather than fundamental problems with the operation itself. The coffee was ready when Jake returned from the barn, his hands stained with motor oil, and his expression showing the satisfaction of someone who had accomplished something concrete before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. Emma poured 2 mugs and settled across from him at the table, where spreadsheets and calculator printouts created a landscape of numbers that told the story of 3 generations of Mitchell ranching. "I've been going through your records," Emma said, indicating the organized stacks of papers with a gesture that encompassed months of work. "The good news is that you're actually making money. The bad news is that you're losing it faster than you're earning it, but not because of anything fundamentally wrong with your operation." Jake leaned forward, his attention focused entirely on what she was telling him, his coffee forgotten as he tried to understand how his family's legacy could be saved. "Show me," he said simply, and Emma felt a flutter of professional excitement at having someone genuinely interested in her analysis rather than dismissing her expertise. Because of her current circumstances, she pulled out a chart she had created showing monthly cash flow patterns, her finger tracing the lines that revealed seasonal trends and recurring expenses that could be better managed with proper planning. "Your cattle sales are actually above market average," she explained, pointing to numbers that represented Jake's skill as a rancher even if he didn't recognize it himself. But you're selling at the wrong times, when everyone else is selling and prices are depressed. If you held some animals for 2 or 3 months and sold during the peak demand periods, you'd increase revenue by at least 20% without changing anything else about your operation. Jake studied the chart, his weathered hands tracing the same lines Emma had shown him, his mind working through the implications of what she was suggesting. The timing makes sense, he said slowly. I've always sold when I needed cash flow, but I never looked at the bigger picture of market cycles. Dad used to talk about strategic timing, but I thought he was just being overly cautious. Turns out he was smarter than I gave him credit for. Emma felt a warm satisfaction at seeing Jake begin to understand the potential of his own operation. But she also knew that identifying problems was only the first step toward solving them. Your father was building something sustainable, she continued, pulling out another spreadsheet that showed equipment depreciation and replacement costs. The challenge now is that some of his investments need updating, and that requires capital that's tied up in daily operations. The irrigation system alone represented a significant expense, but Emma's research had revealed federal agricultural programs that could offset much of the cost through grants and low-interest loans designed to help family farms modernize while maintaining their independence. She had spent hours on the phone with various agencies, navigating bureaucratic requirements with the persistence that had served her well in corporate marketing campaigns. There's money available for exactly the kind of improvements you need, Emma explained, showing Jake the grant applications she had begun preparing. The paperwork is complicated, but the potential funding would cover most of your infrastructure needs and still leave you with ownership and control of the ranch. It's designed specifically for operations like yours that want to preserve traditional ranching while adopting sustainable practices. Jake looked at the grant applications with a mixture of hope and skepticism, his experience with bureaucracy limited to tax forms and cattle inspection reports. This looks like it requires a college degree just to understand the questions, he said with a rueful smile. I'm good with cattle and decent with equipment, but dealing with federal agencies isn't exactly my area of expertise. That's where I come in, Emma said, feeling more useful than she had in months. I've dealt with regulatory compliance and grant applications in my previous work. The language is intimidating, but it's mostly a matter of translating what you do into the terms they want to hear. You manage sustainable grazing practices, you maintain water quality standards, you preserve open space and wildlife habitat. You're already doing everything they want to fund, you just need to document it properly. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, making Emma gasp and place both hands on her belly. Jake's attention immediately shifted from the paperwork to her obvious discomfort, his expression showing the same concern he would have for any pregnant animal on his ranch. You all right? He asked, half rising from his chair as if preparing to call for medical assistance. Just active, Emma assured him, rubbing the spot where small feet had made contact with her ribs. The baby gets more energetic when I'm sitting still for long periods. Dr. Wells always said that was a good sign, that active babies tend to be healthy babies. The reference to her former doctor slipped out before Emma could stop it. Another small crack in the careful story she had constructed about her background. Dr. Wells sounds like she knows her business, Jake said casually. But Emma caught the slight emphasis on the word she's and realized that he was filing away information about her past just as carefully as she was concealing it. A private physician was not something that fit with the image of someone who had ended up homeless and walking along mountain roads in the middle of the night. She was very thorough, Emma said carefully, trying to steer the conversation away from details that might reveal too much about her former life. I should probably find a doctor here in Millfield. Actually, I'm getting close to the point where regular checkups become more important. Jake nodded thoughtfully, his practical nature immediately shifting to problem-solving mode, despite the personal complications that Emma's extended presence might create. Doc Henderson has been taking care of folks in this valley for 40 years, he suggested. He delivered me and half the people I went to school with.
He's not fancy, but he knows what he's doing. And he makes house calls when necessary. I could introduce you if you'd like. The casual offer of help with something as personal as medical care made Emma realize how much she had come to trust Jake's judgment and intentions over the past few days. That would be really helpful, she admitted, allowing herself to accept assistance that she desperately needed despite her reluctance to become more deeply connected to the community, where she was trying to remain invisible. The baby deserves proper medical attention, even if I'm not in an ideal situation to provide it. Jake's expression softened at her admission, and Emma saw in his eyes the same protective instinct she had observed when he talked about his cattle or his land. Your situation isn't as bad as you think it is, he said quietly. You've got skills and intelligence, you're working hard to improve things, and you're putting your baby's needs first. That's more than a lot of people manage even when they have all the advantages. Emma felt her throat tighten with emotion at his matter-of-fact assessment, recognizing that he was seeing qualities in her that she had begun to doubt existed. Later that afternoon, Jake introduced Emma to Dr. Henderson, during what was supposed to be a routine veterinary call to check on a pregnant heifer that had been showing signs of distress. The elderly physician had been making ranch calls for so many decades that the line between human and animal medicine had become comfortably blurred. And he examined both patients with the same gentle competence that had
Earned him the respect of every family in the valley. Young lady, you're carrying that baby well, Dr. Henderson announced after a thorough examination in the ranch house living room that served as a makeshift clinic. Everything looks normal and healthy, but you need to be taking those prenatal vitamins regularly and eating more protein than I suspect you've been getting. Jake, you make sure she's getting 3 good meals a day and plenty of rest. This isn't the time for her to be skipping meals or overexerting herself. The doctor's casual assumption that Jake was responsible for Emma's welfare created an awkward moment that neither of them quite knew how to address. But Emma found herself grateful for the implicit protection that the misunderstanding provided. If people assumed she was under Jake's care, they would be less likely to ask uncomfortable questions about her background or circumstances. Henderson left with promises to check on Emma again in 2 weeks. Jake and Emma found themselves alone with the reality of her advancing pregnancy and the practical implications of her extended stay at the ranch. The baby was due in approximately 8 weeks, a timeline that made any pretense of temporary arrangements seem increasingly unrealistic. I need to be honest with you about something, Emma said as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, the daily ritual that had become their time for more serious conversations. This baby doesn't have a father who's going to be involved. The relationship ended badly, and I'm going to be raising this child alone. I don't want you to feel like you're getting into a situation that's more complicated than you bargained for. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the distant peaks while he processed what she had told him. Everyone's got complications, he said finally. Mine just happened to involve banks and foreclosure notices instead of pregnancy and absent fathers. He turned to look at her directly, his expression serious but not judgmental. The question is whether we're helping each other deal with our complications or whether we're making each other's problems worse. Emma considered his words carefully, recognizing the wisdom in his practical approach to their unusual partnership. I think we're helping each other, she said slowly. At least I hope we are. I know I feel more stable and hopeful than I have in months, and it's not just because of the food and shelter. It's because I feel useful again, like I have something to contribute instead of just being a burden. You're definitely not a burden, Jake assured her, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who meant exactly what he said. Those grant applications alone could save the ranch, and I never would have figured them out on my own. Plus, the books haven't been this organized since my dad was alive. You've got a talent for seeing the big picture and breaking it down into manageable pieces. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle coming up the ranch road, headlights cutting through the gathering darkness as an unfamiliar car approached the house. Jake stood up, his posture alerting Emma to potential trouble even before she saw the tension in his shoulders. Visitors after dark were unusual in this remote area, and Jake's protective instincts were clearly engaged as he stepped slightly in front of Emma's chair. The car proved to be an expensive sedan that looked out of place against the rural backdrop of the ranch, its pristine condition and luxury appointments suggesting urban origins and significant wealth. The man who emerged from the driver's seat was equally out of place, wearing a business suit that probably cost more than Jake's monthly mortgage payment and carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Mr. Mitchell," the stranger said, approaching the porch with the measured stride of someone making a calculated business presentation. "My name is David Chen, and I represent certain interests that might be beneficial to your current situation. I understand you're facing some financial challenges that could be resolved through the right kind of partnership arrangement." Emma felt her blood turn cold at the mention of David's name, recognizing her former assistant despite the darkness and her own desperate hope that she had managed to stay hidden from her family's reach. David's presence at the ranch could only mean that Victoria Rodriguez had tracked her down and that Jake was about to become collateral damage in a family conflict that had already destroyed Emma's previous life. Jake's response was polite but wary, his natural courtesy warring with his suspicion of unexpected visitors bearing offers that sounded too good to be true. "I appreciate your interest, Mr. Chen, but I'm not looking for partners right now. If you're interested in discussing business, you're welcome to call during normal hours and set up a proper appointment." David's smile was professionally pleasant but didn't reach his eyes as he continued his carefully rehearsed pitch. "I think you'll find our proposal worth considering, Mr. Mitchell. We're prepared to offer significantly above market value for your property, enough to clear all your debts and provide a substantial profit for your family's future. These kinds of opportunities don't come along often, especially for operations facing foreclosure." The mention of foreclosure made Jake stiffen, and Emma could see the calculation in David's approach, the way he had researched Jake's vulnerabilities and designed his offer to exploit them. This was exactly the kind of manipulation that had driven Emma away from her family's business, the reduction of people's lives and dreams to leverage points in financial negotiations. "How do you know about my financial situation?" Jake asked, his voice taking on an edge that Emma had never heard before. "That information isn't exactly public knowledge, and I haven't been discussing my business with strangers." David's composure faltered slightly at the direct challenge, but he recovered quickly with the smooth deflection of someone trained in handling difficult questions. "We make it our business to stay informed about investment opportunities in developing markets," he replied smoothly. "Rural properties with development potential are increasingly valuable, and we pride ourselves on identifying them before the competition does. Your ranch represents exactly the kind of strategic acquisition that fits our portfolio perfectly." Emma knew she had to act before David's presence connected her to Jake and brought even more pressure to bear on the man who had offered her sanctuary. Standing up carefully from her chair, she moved toward the porch steps with the deliberate intention of intercepting David before he could say anything that might reveal her identity or her connection to Rodriguez Development Group. "I think you should leave," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority she had once used in corporate boardrooms to shut down unwanted presentations. "Mr. Mitchell isn't interested in your offer, and showing up unannounced at night isn't appropriate business behavior." David's eyes widened as he recognized her, his carefully prepared script abandoned as he processed the implications of finding Emma Rodriguez on a remote Colorado ranch. "Emma," he said, forgetting his cover story in his surprise at seeing his former boss in such unexpected circumstances. "Your mother has been worried sick about you. We've been looking everywhere, and when our investigators traced your movements to this area, I had to see for myself if you were safe." The revelation that Emma was connected to the mysterious visitor sent shockwaves through Jake's understanding of his houseguest and her carefully constructed story about being homeless and alone. "You know this man?" Jake asked, his voice carefully controlled, but Emma could hear the undercurrent of betrayal and confusion that her deception had created. Emma felt the fragile trust they had built over the past week crumbling as the truth about her identity and circumstances became impossible to hide any longer. "David works for my family," Emma admitted, her voice barely above a whisper as she watched Jake's expression harden with the realization that she had been lying to him about fundamental aspects of her situation. "They're not just wealthy, Jake. They're the kind of wealthy that buys and sells ranches like yours for development projects. And David being here means they know where I am." The silence that followed Emma's admission stretched like a physical weight between them, heavy with implications and broken trust. Jake looked from Emma to David and back again, his mind clearly working through the connections between her presence at his ranch and the unexpected business offer that had arrived at his door. "So this is what," Jake said slowly, his voice containing a hurt that cut through Emma more sharply than anger would have. Some kind of setup. You scope out the property from the inside while your people prepare their offer. Make friends with the lonely rancher so he'll be more likely to sell when the time comes. The pain in his voice made Emma's chest tighten with the knowledge that her deception had wounded someone who had shown her nothing but kindness. No, Emma said desperately, stepping toward him despite the way he moved back to maintain distance between them. Jake, it's not like that at all. I didn't know they were tracking me, and I certainly didn't know they were targeting your ranch. I ran away from my family specifically because I couldn't stand the way they do business. Everything I told you about wanting to help you save this place is true. But you didn't tell me who you really are, Jake pointed out, his voice containing the flat disappointment of someone who had been betrayed by people he trusted before. You didn't mention that your family has the resources to solve all my problems if they wanted to, or that you've been living in my house while they plan to buy it out from under me. How am I supposed to believe anything you say now? David stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the personal drama but determined to complete his mission. Emma, your mother asked me to tell you that the offer still stands. Full reinstatement with the company, access to your trust fund, and complete medical care for you and the baby. All you have to do is come home and stop this foolish rebellion against the family that loves you. The word rebellion sparked Emma's anger in a way that David's presence alone hadn't managed to do, and she turned to face him with the fury of someone who had sacrificed everything for her principles only to have them dismissed as childish petulance. Tell my mother that I'd rather raise my child in poverty than on money earned by destroying families like Jake's, she said, her voice shaking with emotion, and tell her that if she wants to buy this ranch, she'll have to do it over my dead body. Jake watched the confrontation between Emma and David with growing understanding of the forces arrayed against his ranch and the impossible position that Emma had been placed in by her family's business practices. The pieces of her story were falling into place now, explaining her expertise with business matters, her expensive belongings, and her reluctance to access resources that could have solved her problems months ago. Mr. Mitchell, David said, turning his attention back to Jake with renewed determination to complete his assignment. I hope you'll consider our offer seriously. We're prepared to be very generous, and frankly, your other options appear quite limited. You could take our money and start fresh somewhere else, or you could continue fighting a battle that you're almost certain to lose anyway. The threat implicit in David's words hung in the mountain air like smoke from a wildfire, and Jake felt his temper rise at the casual arrogance of someone who thought money could solve any problem and buy any solution. Get off my land, he said quietly, but with enough steel in his voice to make David step backward involuntarily. Take your offer and your threats and your corporate manipulation back to whoever sent you, and tell them that some things aren't for sale at any price. David looked between Jake and Emma one more time, calculating whether there was any possibility of completing his mission successfully, or whether retreat was the better option. Very well, he said, with the dignity of someone who had been expecting rejection but was obligated to make the attempt anyway. But Emma, your family won't give up on you. They love you, and they want you to come home where you belong. After David's car disappeared down the ranch road, Jake and Emma stood in the darkness of the porch, the weight of revealed truths hanging between them like a storm cloud ready to break. The easy companionship they had built over the past week felt fragile now, threatened by the knowledge that Emma's presence had brought exactly the kind of corporate pressure that Jake had been trying to avoid. I should go, Emma said quietly, her voice thick with unshed tears and the certainty that she had brought trouble to the one place where she had found peace and purpose. Now that they know where I am, staying here will only make things worse for you. They'll use every kind of pressure they can think of to force you into selling, and my being here gives them leverage they didn't have before. Jake was quiet for a long time, staring out at the mountains that had sheltered his family for 3 generations, weighing the risks of keeping Emma against the certainty that sending her away would leave them both facing their problems alone. Running away didn't solve anything the first time, he said finally. What makes you think it'll work any better now? Emma looked at him in surprise, having expected anger and rejection rather than the thoughtful consideration he was showing despite her deception. Because now they know where I am, she said simply. David will report back to my mother, and she'll use whatever leverage she can find to get what she wants.
Your financial troubles make you vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation they specialize in. Maybe so, Jake acknowledged, turning to face her directly. But seems to me that running from your family's money hasn't solved your problems either. You're still pregnant, still alone, still trying to figure out how to build a life for you and your baby. And now you've got me and this ranch tangled up in your story whether we like it or not. The truth of his words settled over Emma like a heavy blanket, forcing her to acknowledge that her months of running had only delayed the inevitable confrontation with her family's expectations and her own need to create stability for her unborn child. I don't know how to fight them, she admitted, her voice breaking with the frustration of someone who had tried everything she could think of and still found herself backed into a corner. Well, Jake said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, despite the seriousness of their situation. Lucky for you, I come from a long line of people who were too stubborn to know when they were beat. Maybe it's time we stopped running from our problems and started figuring out how to solve them together. The morning after David's visit dawned gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering over the Rockies like an omen of the battles ahead. Emma woke to the sound of Jake already moving around in the kitchen, but the easy domesticity they had established over the past week felt strained now, weighted with the knowledge of who she really was and what her presence meant for his already precarious situation. She dressed carefully, choosing her simplest clothes as if somehow appearing less privileged could undo the revelation of her family's wealth and influence. Jake was standing at the window with his coffee when she entered the kitchen, his posture tense as he studied the approaching weather system that would likely bring the season's first serious snow. Without his usual morning greeting, he poured her a cup of coffee and set it on the table where the financial documents they had been working on yesterday seemed to mock their naive hope that problems could be solved through careful planning and hard work. Storm coming, Jake said without turning around, his voice carrying layers of meaning that had nothing to do with meteorology. Could be a bad one, judging by those clouds. Emma understood that he was talking about more than weather, that the storm represented the corporate forces gathering against his ranch and the family pressure that would soon descend on both of them with the full weight of Rodriguez Development Group's resources and determination. Jake, she began, but he held up a hand to stop her, still not turning away from the window where the first snowflakes were beginning to fall with the lazy confidence of a storm that intended to stay for a while. Before you say anything, he said quietly, I need you to understand something. Yesterday, I thought I was helping someone who had nowhere else to go. Today, I find out I've been harboring the daughter of the people trying to destroy everything my family built. That changes things between us, whether we want it to or not. The pain in his voice cut through Emma's chest like a physical wound, and she felt the familiar crushing weight of guilt that had driven her away from her family's world in the first place. Every choice she made seemed to hurt people she cared about. Every attempt to do the right thing created collateral damage that spread outward like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. I never meant for this to happen, she said, her voice barely audible above the wind that was beginning to howl around the cabin's eaves. I know that, Jake replied, finally turning to face her with eyes that held more sadness than anger. But meaning doesn't change the facts. Your family knows where you are now, and they're going to use that knowledge to pressure both of us. They'll come at me with offers and threats, and they'll come at you with guilt and family obligation. Either way, we're both going to end up paying the price for whatever decision we make. Emma sank into her chair at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug for warmth as much as comfort, the baby moving restlessly inside her as if sensing the tension that filled the room like smoke. She had known this moment would come eventually, had been dreading it since the day she walked away from her family's fortune, but the reality of watching Jake struggle with the implications of her deception was worse than any nightmare she had imagined. The phone rang with the sharp insistence of bad news, and Jake answered it with the weary resignation of someone who had been expecting another crisis. Maria's voice carried clearly across the kitchen, her words tumbling over each other in her excitement about an unexpected development that had emerged overnight while Jake dealt with his own family revelations. Jake, you need to get to town right now, Maria said, her real estate agent's training evident in the way she organized complex information into actionable steps. There are 3 different development companies asking about properties in our area, and 2 of them are specifically interested in ranches with water rights and mountain access. The prices they're talking about are astronomical, but there's something coordinated about the way they're all moving at once. Emma felt her stomach clench with recognition of her mother's business tactics, the way Rodriguez Development Group created artificial competition to drive up prices and make their eventual offers seem more reasonable by comparison. Victoria was orchestrating a campaign designed to pressure every ranch owner in the valley simultaneously, making Jake feel isolated and desperate while actually preparing to eliminate any competing bids for the properties she really wanted. Jake listened to his sister's report with growing understanding of the forces arrayed against not just his ranch but every family operation in the valley, his jaw tightening as he recognized the calculated nature of the assault on their traditional way of life. When he hung up the phone, he looked at Emma with new comprehension of the scope of her family's ambitions and the ruthless efficiency with which they pursued their goals. "They're not just coming after my ranch, are they?" he said, not really asking a question but stating a realization that changed everything about their situation. "This is bigger than one property or one family's financial problems. They're trying to buy up the entire valley, turn the whole area into some kind of luxury development project for wealthy people who want to play cowboy on weekends." Emma nodded miserably, her business background allowing her to see the strategic brilliance of her mother's approach even as she despised the human cost of such tactics. "It's called area development," she explained, her voice hollow with the knowledge of how many communities had been transformed by similar projects. "They identify a region with development potential, then systematically acquire all the key properties through a combination of generous offers to willing sellers and pressure tactics for resistant owners. Once they control enough land, they can reshape the entire area according to their vision." The baby kicked strongly, as if protesting the conversation about corporate manipulation and family betrayal, and Emma's hand moved instinctively to the spot where her child was making its displeasure known. The thought of raising her baby in a world where such tactics were considered normal business practice made her feel sick, but the alternative of fighting against her family's resources and influence seemed equally impossible. Jake stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound like breaking bones, and began pacing the small kitchen with the restless energy of someone who had been backed into a corner and was looking for a way to fight back. "So what do we do?" he asked, his voice containing the steel that had sustained 3 generations of Mitchell men through droughts and depressions and every other challenge the mountains could throw at them. "Do we roll over and let them win, or do we figure out how to fight?" Emma looked up at him with surprise, having expected him to ask her to leave or to distance himself from the complications her presence had brought into his life. Instead, he was talking about we and fighting, as if her deception hadn't changed his fundamental willingness to stand alongside her against impossible odds. "I don't know how to fight them," she admitted, her voice breaking with the frustration of someone who had already tried every strategy she could think of. "They have more money, more lawyers, more political connections than we could ever match. When I tried to expose their practices before, they destroyed my career and turned my own family against me." "Money and lawyers aren't everything," Jake said, stopping his pacing to look directly at her with the kind of quiet determination that had built the Lazy M Ranch from nothing but determination and stubbornness. "They might have resources, but we have something they don't understand. We have people who actually care about this place, who see it as more than just a commodity to be bought and sold. That has to count for something." The sound of vehicles approaching the ranch interrupted their conversation, and Jake moved to the window to see a small convoy of expensive cars making their way up the ranch road through the falling snow. Emma joined him at the window, her heart sinking as she recognized the lead vehicle as her mother's personal Mercedes. Flanked by 2 SUVs that undoubtedly carried lawyers and corporate executives prepared to bring overwhelming pressure to bear on their resistance. Victoria Rodriguez emerged from her car with the regal bearing of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any situation. Her designer coat a sharp contrast to the rustic ranch setting where she had come to reclaim her wayward daughter and secure another property for her development empire. Emma hadn't seen her mother in 6 months, but Victoria looked exactly the same, perfectly groomed, expensively dressed and radiating the kind of controlled authority that made lesser mortals step aside without conscious thought. The entourage that accompanied Victoria included David Chen, looking uncomfortable in his role as messenger between the Rodriguez family and their rebellious daughter, and two men in expensive suits who had the predatory stillness of corporate lawyers prepared to destroy anyone who stood between their client and her objectives. Emma recognized the lead attorney as Marcus Sterling, her mother's personal counsel and the architect of many hostile takeovers that had enriched Rodriguez Development Group while devastating local communities. Jake opened the door before Victoria could knock, his posture straight and his expression carefully neutral as he faced the woman who represented everything he had been fighting against for the past year. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I presume," he said with the courtesy his upbringing demanded but without the warmth that genuine welcome would have required. "Emma's told me a lot about your family's business practices." Victoria's smile was perfectly calibrated to suggest both maternal concern and corporate confidence, the expression of someone who had negotiated dozens of similar confrontations and emerged victorious from all of them. "Mr. Mitchell," she replied smoothly, "I appreciate you taking care of my daughter during her difficult time, but I'm here to bring her home where she belongs. We can discuss appropriate compensation for your trouble, of course." The casual assumption that everything and everyone had a price made Jake's jaw tighten, but he stepped aside to allow Victoria and her entourage to enter his home, understanding that the confrontation could not be avoided and preferring to face it on ground of his own choosing. Emma stood by the kitchen table like a defendant awaiting sentencing, her hands protectively covering her belly as she prepared for the emotional manipulation she knew her mother would deploy with surgical precision. "Emma, darling," Victoria said, her voice carrying the perfect blend of relief and reproach that mothers had been using to guilt their children for centuries. "You look terrible. This mountain isolation isn't good for you or the baby. I've brought Dr. Wells with me, and she's very concerned about your prenatal care. You need to come home where you can receive proper medical attention." The mention of her former physician, waiting in one of the SUVs like a medical trump card, revealed the thoroughness of Victoria's preparation and the extent to which she had anticipated every possible objection to Emma's return to the family fold. But Emma had spent months learning to recognize manipulation tactics that had once seemed like loving concern, and she stood her ground despite the familiar guilt that her mother's presence invariably triggered. "I'm receiving excellent medical care from Dr. Henderson," Emma replied, her voice steadier than she had expected given the circumstances. "He's been taking care of people in this valley for 40 years, and he makes house calls when necessary. I don't need Dr. Wells or anyone else from your world telling me how to take care of my baby." Victoria's expression flickered with annoyance at Emma's resistance, but she recovered quickly with the professional smoothness of someone who had spent decades negotiating with difficult opponents. "Very well," she said, her tone becoming more businesslike as she abandoned the maternal approach in favor of direct corporate
Pressure. "If you insist on staying here, then we need to discuss the terms of your arrangement with Mr. Mitchell." She gestured to Marcus Sterling, who stepped forward with a briefcase full of legal documents designed to transform every human relationship into contractual obligations that could be controlled and manipulated. "We've prepared a generous compensation package for Mr. Mitchell," Victoria continued, her voice taking on the crisp efficiency that had built her real estate empire. "Enough to clear all his debts, pay fair market value for his property, and provide a substantial bonus for his cooperation in this family matter." Jake's response was immediate and unequivocal, delivered with the quiet dignity of someone whose principles were not negotiable regardless of the financial pressure brought to bear against them. "I'm not interested in your money, Mrs. Rodriguez," he said simply. "Emma is welcome to stay here as long as she chooses, and that welcome doesn't come with a price tag or contractual obligations." The rejection of her offer seemed to genuinely surprise Victoria, who had clearly expected Jake's financial desperation to make him amenable to whatever terms she proposed. She looked around the modest ranch house with its handmade furniture and family photographs, her expression suggesting that she couldn't comprehend anyone choosing such simplicity over the luxury her money could provide. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge as she abandoned diplomacy in favor of direct pressure. "I don't think you understand the full scope of your situation. My company has options on several properties in this valley, and we're prepared to develop them with or without your cooperation. Your ranch will be surrounded by luxury homes and resort facilities whether you participate or not. Wouldn't it be better to profit from the inevitable changes rather than fighting them? The threat was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had used similar tactics countless times before, but Victoria had miscalculated the effect such pressure would have on a man whose family had been fighting for survival in these mountains for 3 generations. Instead of intimidating Jake, her words only strengthened his resolve to resist the corporate takeover that threatened to destroy everything his ancestors had built. "Let me make something clear to you and your lawyers," Jake said, his voice carrying the steel that had sustained Mitchell men through 60 years of mountain living. "This ranch has been in my family since before your company existed, and it'll be here long after you've moved on to destroying someone else's community. You can buy every other property in this valley if you want, but the Lazy Men isn't for sale at any price." Emma felt a surge of pride and affection for Jake's principled stand, but she also knew her mother well enough to recognize that Victoria was far from finished with her campaign to secure both the ranch and her daughter's compliance. The legal documents that Marcus Sterling carried represented months of preparation and the kind of comprehensive strategy that had rarely failed to achieve Rodriguez Development Group's objectives. Victoria's smile became sharper as she signaled for Marcus to begin the next phase of their assault, the legal pressure designed to complement the financial inducements that Jake had rejected. "Mr. Sterling has some information about your financial situation that might change your perspective," she said with the satisfaction of someone playing a winning hand in a high-stakes game. Marcus opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder of documents that had clearly been compiled through extensive research and possibly illegal surveillance of Jake's personal affairs. "Your mortgage payments are 3 months behind," he announced with clinical precision, "and the bank has already initiated foreclosure proceedings. Your cattle operation is losing money due to poor market timing and inadequate capitalization. You owe substantial sums to veterinary services, equipment suppliers, and various other creditors who are beginning to question your ability to pay." The litany of Jake's financial problems, delivered with the cold efficiency of an autopsy report, was designed to demonstrate the futility of resistance and the wisdom of accepting Victoria's generous offer. But instead of breaking Jake's resolve, the invasion of his privacy only strengthened his determination to fight against people who saw his family's struggles as leverage to be exploited for corporate gain. Emma watched the confrontation with growing anger at her mother's tactics and increasing admiration for Jake's refusal to be intimidated by threats and manipulation. The contrast between Victoria's corporate ruthlessness and Jake's principled simplicity made clear why Emma had chosen exile from her family's world, even as it demonstrated the impossible odds they faced in trying to preserve the ranch and the way of life it represented. The baby chose that moment to deliver a series of strong kicks that made Emma gasp and double over slightly. Her hands pressed to her belly as she tried to calm the agitated movements inside her. The stress of the confrontation was clearly affecting both mother and child, and Jake immediately moved to her side with the protective instincts that had made him offer shelter to a pregnant stranger on a cold mountain road. "Dr. Wells needs to examine you immediately," Victoria announced, her maternal concern overriding her corporate agenda as she saw her daughter's obvious distress. "This kind of stress isn't good for the baby, and mountain medical care isn't adequate for high-risk pregnancies. You're coming home with me right now, and we'll sort out these other complications later." But Emma had endured too much to surrender now, and she straightened up with the determination of someone who had finally found something worth fighting for. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. "This is my home now, with Jake and the life we're building together. Your money and threats and corporate manipulation can't change that." The declaration of her commitment to Jake and the ranch surprised everyone in the room, including Emma herself. But as soon as the words were spoken, she knew they represented the truth she had been avoiding for weeks. She loved Jake Mitchell with his weathered hands and principled stubbornness, loved the ranch with its simple beauty and generational continuity, loved the possibility of raising her child in a place where values mattered more than profit margins. Victoria's composure finally cracked as she realized that her daughter was choosing poverty and uncertainty over the security and privilege that Rodriguez family money could provide. "You're throwing away your entire future for a man you barely know," she said, her voice rising with frustration and genuine bewilderment. "This ranch will be foreclosed within months, and then where will you be? Homeless again with a baby to support and no resources except stubborn pride. Maybe so, Emma replied quietly, her hand finding Jake's and drawing strength from the call-used warmth of his fingers intertwined with hers. But at least I'll be able to look at my child and know that the life we built together was earned honestly, without destroying other people's dreams to pay for our comfort. The simplicity of Emma's response seemed to deflate Victoria's corporate bluster, revealing the hurt mother underneath the business executive who had spent 6 months searching for her missing daughter. For a moment, the expensive coat and perfect makeup couldn't hide the fact that Victoria Rodriguez was simply a woman who wanted her child to come home, even if home had become a place that Emma could no longer tolerate. Marcus Sterling cleared his throat diplomatically, reminding everyone of the legal realities that couldn't be overcome through emotional appeals or principled stands. The foreclosure proceedings will continue regardless of family reconciliation, he announced with professional detachment. Mr. Mitchell's debts exceed his assets, and the bank's patience has been exhausted. Without significant capital injection, this property will be sold at auction within 60 days. The stark financial facts hung in the air, like smoke from a wildfire, unavoidable and potentially devastating to everyone's carefully constructed plans and principles. Jake's grip on Emma's hand tightened as he faced the possibility that his family's legacy would be lost despite their determination to preserve it. While Emma calculated whether her trust fund might be enough to save the ranch without compromising the values that had driven her away from her family's world, Victoria recognized the moment of vulnerability and pressed her advantage with the instincts of someone who had built a fortune by identifying and exploiting other people's weaknesses. "The offer stands," she said quietly, her voice containing both threat and promise. "Full payment of all debts, fair market value for the property, and complete medical care for Emma and the baby. All you have to do is accept the inevitable and stop fighting forces that are bigger than both of you." The silence that followed Victoria's final offer stretched like a held breath, heavy with the weight of impossible choices and irreconcilable values. Emma looked around the kitchen where she had found peace and purpose, at the man who had offered her shelter without knowing who she was or what complications she might bring, at the mountain vista beyond the windows where snow was falling more heavily now, blanketing the landscape in pristine white that made everything seem possible and pure. Jake broke the silence with the quiet dignity that had characterized his response to every crisis and opportunity since Emma had entered his life. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a mountain avalanche that changes the landscape forever. "I appreciate your concern for Emma and the baby, but this ranch isn't going to be sold to your company or anyone else who wants to turn it into something it was never meant to be." He turned to Emma with eyes that held both love and determination, the expression of someone who had decided to risk everything for the chance to build something meaningful and lasting. "If you'll have me," he continued, addressing her directly while Victoria and her entourage watched in stunned silence, "I'd like to ask you to marry me. Not because of the baby, or the ranch, or any of the complications we're facing, but because I love you and I want to spend whatever time we have left building something together that's worth more than money." Emma's response was immediate and certain, delivered with the clarity of someone who had finally found her true north after months of wandering in confusion and doubt. "Yes," she said simply, her voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "Yes to marriage, yes to fighting for this ranch, yes to building a life that our children can be proud of." The engagement announcement transformed the corporate negotiation into something more personal and more complicated. As Victoria realized that her daughter was not just choosing temporary rebellion but permanent exile from the Rodriguez family empire, the legal and financial pressures that had seemed so overwhelming moments before suddenly appeared manageable compared to the emotional stakes of a mother losing her child to values that she couldn't understand or accept. Marcus Sterling began packing his documents with the efficient movements of someone who recognized when a negotiation had moved beyond legal remedies, while David Chen looked between Emma and Victoria with the uncomfortable awareness that his role as messenger between them was becoming increasingly irrelevant. The corporate machinery that had seemed so powerful and inevitable was suddenly revealed as merely human, capable of being stopped by love and stubbornness and the simple refusal to accept that everything meaningful could be bought and sold.
Victoria stood in the ranch house kitchen for a long moment, studying her daughter's face as if trying to memorize features that she might never see again. Finally, she reached into her purse and withdrew an envelope that she placed on the table beside the financial documents that had failed to achieve their intended purpose. "Your trust fund," she said quietly, her voice containing none of the corporate authority that had characterized her earlier threats and offers. $2.8 million that your grandmother left specifically for your independence, no strings attached and no corporate involvement. It's yours regardless of what you choose to do about the family business or your relationship with me." Emma stared at the envelope as if it might explode, understanding that accepting her grandmother's bequest would solve all of Jake's financial problems while maintaining her moral independence from Rodriguez Development Group. The money represented security for her child and salvation for the ranch, but it also represented the final bridge between her old life and her chosen future. "Take it," Victoria continued, her voice breaking slightly with emotions that corporate training couldn't suppress. "If you're determined to live in poverty and struggle against impossible odds, at least give your child and your husband the resources they need to survive your principled choices." With trembling hands, Emma picked up the envelope and held it against her chest like a shield, feeling the weight of possibilities it contained for the ranch, for Jake, for the baby who would be born into whatever world they managed to create together. This money had never been part of her family's corporate empire, had been specifically designated by her grandmother as a tool for women's independence rather than corporate expansion. Jake watched Emma's internal struggle with understanding and patience, recognizing that the decision to accept or refuse her inheritance would define not just their financial future, but the fundamental nature of their partnership and their values as a family. Whatever choice she made, he would stand beside her, but the choice itself had to be hers alone. The baby kicked strongly, as if voting for the security that the trust fund could provide, and Emma made her decision with the same clarity that had guided her engagement acceptance moments earlier. She opened the envelope and examined the legal documents that would transfer control of her inheritance from corporate trustees to her personal control, free of any conditions or oversight from Rodriguez Development Group. "This money will save the ranch," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had found her purpose and was prepared. "But it comes with conditions that have nothing to do with my family's business practices. We use it to preserve this place as a working ranch, not as an investment property or development opportunity. We prove that traditional ways of life can survive in the modern economy without selling out to corporate interests." Jake's response was immediate and wholehearted, delivered with the enthusiasm of someone who had been offered not just financial salvation but true partnership with someone who shared his deepest values. "Together," he said, reaching for Emma's hand and drawing her close despite the audience of corporate executives and family members who watched their display of affection with varying degrees of approval and dismay. Victoria gathered her coat and purse with the dignity of someone who had lost a battle but wasn't ready to concede the war, understanding that her daughter's marriage and financial independence had fundamentally altered the dynamics between them, but not necessarily ended all possibility of future relationship. "The offer remains open," she said, as she moved toward the door, her words addressing both Jake and Emma, but carrying the particular weight of a mother's unconditional love despite profound disagreement. "If you change your minds about building a life on stubbornness and principle, you know how to reach me. But I hope you'll at least allow me to be a grandmother to my grandchild, even if you can't accept me as family in any other way." Emma's response was immediate and generous, delivered with the wisdom of someone who understood that cutting all ties with family was neither necessary nor healthy for the child she carried. "The baby will know both grandmothers," she promised, her voice containing both firmness and compassion. "Our children will understand their heritage and their choices, including the choice to value principle over profit." After Victoria and her entourage departed, Jake and Emma stood together in the sudden quiet of their kitchen, listening to the wind howling around the cabin and watching snow fall more heavily outside windows that framed their mountain sanctuary. The trust fund documents lay spread on the table beside Jake's ranch records. representing the resources that would transform their struggle for survival into an opportunity to prove that traditional values could thrive in the modern world. The engagement ring Jake produced from his pocket was simple and honest, a single diamond set in a plain gold band that reflected the straightforward nature of their partnership and their commitment to building something meaningful rather than merely impressive. When he slipped it onto Emma's finger, the fit was perfect, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment and this choice. Their wedding took place 6 weeks later in the ranch house living room, with Dr. Henderson serving as witness and Maria crying tears of joy as she watched her stubborn brother finally find someone who understood both his strength and his vulnerability. Emma wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to accommodate her advancing pregnancy, while Jake wore his father's suit, cleaned and pressed for the occasion but carrying the subtle scent of hay and leather that no amount of dry cleaning could completely eliminate. The ceremony was simple and genuine, focused on promises rather than pageantry, on commitment rather than performance. They exchanged vows they had written together, words that spoke of partnership through uncertainty, of love that chose growth over comfort, of family built on shared values rather than shared DNA. When their daughter was born 2 months later, during the worst blizzard in 20 years, Dr. Henderson delivered her in the ranch house bedroom, while Jake held Emma's hand and whispered encouragement that competed with the wind howling around their mountain home. The baby emerged healthy and strong, with Emma's dark eyes and Jake's determined chin, already displaying the kind of stubborn vitality that would serve her well in the challenging and rewarding life her parents were building together. They named her Sarah Grace Mitchell, honoring both Jake's sister and Emma's grandmother, the two women whose support had made their unconventional partnership possible. The baby's first sounds mixed with the lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through aspens, ranch sounds that would form the soundtrack of her childhood and shape her understanding of what home meant. 3 years later, the Lazy M Ranch had become a model of sustainable agriculture that attracted visitors from around the world who wanted to understand how traditional ranching could adapt and thrive in the modern economy. Emma's business expertise, combined with Jake's practical knowledge and their shared commitment to environmental stewardship, had created something that was both profitable and principled, both innovative and rooted in generations of mountain wisdom. The ranch employed 12 people year-round, including several young families who had returned to the valley after college to build lives that combined modern education with traditional values. The operation had expanded to include organic vegetables, free-range chickens, and a small cheese-making facility that supplied restaurants throughout Colorado with products that carried the taste of mountain grass and clean water. Sarah Grace toddled through the ranch yard with the confident curiosity of a child who had never known fear or want, followed by Blue's offspring and protected by the watchful eyes of extended family that included both blood relatives and chosen community. She spoke her first words in the barn, while Jake milked cows, her baby voice mixing with the sounds of animals and machinery in a language that was both ancient and modern. Victoria Rodriguez visited twice a year, arriving in expensive cars that seemed increasingly out of place against the prosperous simplicity of the ranch her money had helped save. Her relationship with Emma remained complicated, marked by love and respect that couldn't quite bridge the philosophical gulf between their different understandings of success and responsibility. But Victoria's relationship with her granddaughter was uncomplicated and joyful, marked by the kind of unconditional affection that transcends differences of opinion about business practices and life choices. Sarah Grace called her Grandma Vicky and showed her pictures of calves and chickens, with the same enthusiasm she displayed for the expensive toys that arrived from Denver on every birthday and holiday. Emma and Jake's marriage had deepened and strengthened through the challenges of building their life together. Their partnership, based on mutual respect and shared work rather than romantic fantasy or financial convenience. They had learned to navigate disagreements with the patience of people who trusted each other's fundamental integrity. And they had discovered that love expressed through daily cooperation and common cause was more durable than passion built on attraction alone. Their second child was born during the spring roundup, a son they named Thomas David Mitchell in honor of Jake's father and Emma's former assistant, who had become an unlikely ally in their struggle to preserve the ranch's independence. The boy arrived with his father's steady temperament and his mother's quick intelligence, destined to inherit a legacy that combined the best elements of both their families' traditions. As Emma stood on the ranch house porch watching Jake teach their daughter to rope fence posts while their son napped in her arms, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from corporate boardrooms to mountain meadows. From family conflict to chosen family, from running away from her problems to building solutions that honored both principle and practicality. The ranch spread before her in the golden light of late afternoon, cattle grazing in pastures maintained through sustainable practices, buildings that combined traditional architecture with modern efficiency, gardens that fed both family and community. It was not the life she had been raised to expect, but it was the life she had chosen, and that choice had made all the difference. The trust fund money had been invested wisely, providing security without excess, prosperity without ostentation. The ranch was profitable but not exploitative, successful but not corporate, modern but not disconnected from the wisdom of previous generations. It represented the kind of middle path that Emma had been seeking without knowing it existed. A way of living that honored both innovation and tradition. Jake finished his lesson with Sarah Grace and walked toward the house where his wife waited with their son, his movements displaying the easy confidence of someone who had found his place in the world and was content to occupy it fully. When he reached the porch, he wrapped his arms around both Emma and the baby, creating a circle of warmth and security that spoke of love expressed through daily choice rather than grand gesture. Their children would grow up understanding that wealth meant more than money, that success meant more than profit, that family meant more than blood relation. They would learn to work with their hands and think with their heads, to respect the past while building the future, to stand up for their principles while remaining open to growth and change. As the sun set behind the mountains that had sheltered the Mitchell family for 3 generations, Emma and Jake stood together on the porch that had witnessed their first honest conversation, their engagement, their children's first steps, and countless ordinary moments that had woven together into a life worth living. The ranch would endure, not because it was protected by corporate power or government subsidy, but because it was rooted in values that transcended economic cycles and cultural trends. Love and work and stubborn determination had proved stronger than money and manipulation, and that victory belonged not just to Jake and Emma but to everyone who chose principle over profit, community over competition, and hope over fear. In the distance, cattle called to each other as they settled for the night, and the wind whispered through aspens that had witnessed the birth of dreams and the triumph of love over circumstances that had once seemed impossible to overcome. The Lazy M Ranch was home now, not just to the Mitchell family, but to the idea that ordinary people could build extraordinary lives when they were willing to work for what they believed in, and stand together against forces that tried to reduce everything meaningful to dollars and cents. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.